Welcome again, friends, to our third webinar of the Liberating People and the Planet series. My name is Francisco Garcia, and I am a Wendland-Cook Program fellow, a PhD student at Vanderbilt University in theological studies. And we're delighted that you're joining us today for this conversation called Rooted in the Web of Life, Conversations about Deep Solidarity at the intersections of ecology, economics, and religion. We're grateful that people are joining us near and far, and that throughout this webinar series, we've been joined by participants from every continent. I'd also like to mention that this webinar is being live streamed live on our Facebook page, the Wendland-Cook Program Facebook page. Feel free to share that live stream on your social media platforms. A little over a month ago, we initiated this webinar series featuring a lively conversation about the need for collective liberation for both people and planet, and how religion as we know it has often been a problem, but also what kinds of solutions and actions we might begin to construct. We have touched on how these themes are only being reinforced in the global pandemic of COVID-19. As we deepen these conversations about the meaning and practice of solidarity, we acknowledge the litany of abuses that have been taking place, especially at this moment in the Black community. And we stand in solidarity with the uprising, with the feelings of unrest and the calls for justice and liberation. We acknowledge and we are horrified at the police abuses that took place, the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Tony McDade, and others at the hands of police and vigilantes. We can't speak of people's liberation, or any liberation for that matter, without speaking of and working for Black liberation. And we also need to acknowledge that the systems of racial oppression and economic exploitation have been inseparable from the beginning. We must name how our theological and social movements can move us in this direction. And in that spirit, we've offered a statement of solidarity on how Wendland-Cook is working to contribute to this effort of justice and liberation in partnership in these contexts. That statement can be found on our website and on our Facebook page. At the Wendland-Cook Program in Religion and Justice, we are investigating how religion can become part of the solution rather than remain part of the problem. Aided by liberative theologies developed in the past decades and throughout history, we see hope emerging in unexpected places. Those who are most affected by the pressures of our age are not just victims, they are also becoming agents. In this climate, we seek to contribute our part to a re-emerging spirit of solidarity that was long declared missing or impossible. As we jump into the conversation, we want to provide a few instructions on how audience participation will work. The chat function will be open, and we encourage you to post questions and comments in that chat section. We also want to encourage you, when you post, to include all panelists and all attendees so that my colleague Erin and I can follow along and ensure that our moderators are able to follow these questions and engage our panelists in today's conversation. Please know that when you post in that way, that your question will be seen by other attendees. You can also post comments and questions if you're following us on the Facebook live stream, and we'll be monitoring those questions as well. Now to our moderators for the conversation. I'd like to hand things over to Annika Rieger and Joerg Rieger as our moderators. Joerg Rieger is the director of the Wendland-Cook Program in Religion and Justice, the Distinguished Professor of Theology, and the Cal Turner Chancellor's Chair in Wesleyan Studies at the Divinity School, and the Graduate Department in Religion at Vanderbilt University. Annika Rieger is a doctoral student in the Department of Sociology at Boston College. Her primary areas of research are environmental sociology and political economy. Her current research project utilizes quantitative and computational methods to investigate how transnational corporations contribute and respond to climate change. She has published several academic articles, one of them on engaging economists and religion in the debate on climate change, co-authored with her father, Joerg Rieger. Joerg and Annika.
Thank you so much, Francisco, for this introduction. It's great to be back again with one of our webinars. Today's conversation is titled Deep Solidarity Rooted in the Web of Life. And it's the third of a set of conversations. If you're interested in the previous two webinars, you can find them on our website. Solidarity is a complex idea that needs to be not only deepened, but sometimes reconstructed. And we want to do that today in light of the exploitation of people and the planet. We believe that solidarity is crucial for the liberation of the human species, but we're also finding evidence that solidarity extends beyond humanity, including all of the ecosphere. We know that everything in this world is connected, but how do we make this work for liberation? Once again, we will also ask the question of religion. We know it is often part of the problem, but we're curious, can it also be part of the solution, and how? Let me quickly note that these conversations are based on a conference that we were supposed to have at Vanderbilt in March, which was canceled because of COVID. But you will find the papers eventually produced and published in a book that Jeremy Posadas and I are editing. So look for that next year.
All right, so let me now introduce our two panelists for today. First, we have Jeremy Posadas, who teaches on the rural border of Texas and Oklahoma at Austin College, where he holds the John F. Anderson Chair of Christian Thought and directs the Gender Studies program. This spring, Jeremy served as Wendland-Cook's first faculty fellow, developing an eco-queer ethics against capitalism. In addition, he serves as the co-chair of the American Academy of Religion's Class, Religion, and Theology group. We also have with us today Dr. Timothy R. Eberhart, who is an associate professor of theology and ecology at Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary, where he directs the MA in Public Ministry degree and oversees a concentration in ecological regeneration. He teaches in the areas of theology and ethics, concentrating on the relation of Christian doctrine to environmental, economic, political, and social change theory. His publications include Rooted and Grounded in Love, Holy Communion for the Whole Creation, The Economy of Salvation, Essays in Honor of M. Douglas Meeks, as well as chapters on mission, ecclesiology, and eco-theology. He also co-chairs the newly launched Institute for Christian Socialism.
Let me add a quick word of welcome. It's exciting to be working with all of you. Jeremy, you and I have worked for a long time on issues of religion and class. We've worked together in the American Academy of Religion, in the Class and Theology unit. And it was great to have you as a faculty fellow at Vanderbilt in the Wendland-Cook Program this spring. So I'm glad that we're continuing this relationship in our webinar today. And Timothy, we've known each other for quite some time also, before you started your PhD, and I've followed your work with great interest. Our paths touch sometimes in the world of Methodism, sometimes outside of it. It's great to have you here to talk about religion, economics, and ecology. So welcome to you both.
All right,
Thank you, Joerg and Annika. Great to be with all of you today.
Great. So now that we have the introductions out of the way, let's get right to the questions. So I'll start us off with the first kind of broad umbrella question. So a common theme in these webinars is the insight that what exploits and oppresses people is also what exploits and oppresses the planet. And that is why the Wendland-Cook program considers ecological and economic justice to be inextricably related. So as Francisco stated at the beginning, today's webinar is focused on solidarity, which is an essential component to the success of social movements, including those that have recently resurged. But one common pattern among social movements, past and present, is that they tend to call for change to political and social institutions rather than economic institutions. And I want to keep the role of solidarity in social movements as well as calls for economic change in mind as we discuss this first question. So Jeremy and Tim, I would like to ask you both this question, which we've been asking every panelist on these webinars, and that is, what do people and the planet need to be liberated from? So Jeremy, let me turn to you first.
Yeah, thanks so much, Annika. And it's just such a joy to be with you and Joerg and Tim and the audience for this conversation. I had such a great time this semester with the program, and it's great to be here today. And I appreciate your comments just now framing this, because one thing I've been thinking a lot about lately is how people and the planet need to be liberated from both state violence and corporate violence. So for example, in the US in recent years, police have killed about 1,100 people a year. That's according to the Mapping Police Violence online database. And in that same period, the past few years, corporations have caused about 5 times that number of deaths just through unsafe working conditions. So that's 5,000 preventable deaths every year caused directly by corporations. That's even before coronavirus. We can add to that the tens of thousands of people who die every year due to lack of health insurance or lack of adequate health insurance, right? These are deaths directly caused by the actions and policies of for-profit health insurance corporations. And then of course, there's all of the environmental damage that's done by corporations as well. And let me be clear, none of these deaths, whether caused by the state or corporations, is morally acceptable. And we have to struggle to eradicate all of these forces of violence and death. But I think one of the challenges is that it's easier to focus on state violence because, and here I'm going to use Rob Nixon, an environmental scholar, I'm going to use his concept of spectacular violence versus slow violence. Spectacular violence is violence that happens at a speed that makes it easy to comprehend as a distinct act. And state violence is often that kind of violence. But slow violence, on the other hand, is violence that happens at a pace that it's harder to wrap our heads around, but is no less harmful. And corporate violence is often that kind of slow violence. So we need to be liberated both from spectacular violence by the state especially, and slow violence, which is particularly by corporations. And we have to hold both of those before us, I think.
Great, thank you so much for those comments. But now I'd also like to give Tim a chance to respond to the question.
Thanks, Annika. At the most basic level, I would say that we are suffering from a host of interconnected systems of domination, right? So Cedric Robinson calls it racial capitalism. We could call it the modern Western colonial project or neoliberalism. Bell Hooks probably has the best description in calling the sum of these systems imperial, white racist, heteropatriarchal capitalism. And I actually think it's helpful to draw upon a range of these perspectives because altogether, I think we can begin to see some of the general features that many of these domination systems share. So first is a kind of dualistic logic that divides the world into opposites, the white-black binary, male-female, civilized, uncivilized, straight, queer. But then there's the logic of hierarchy, in which one of the two are deemed superior to the other. And then third, these systems draw upon the first two logics to justify the subjugation, the conquest of whatever or whoever is deemed subordinate. Now, there's a related hierarchical dualism embedded within the modern imperial economy that I want to focus on here. And that's the logic in which human nature is deemed separate from and superior to non-human nature. It's the basic assumption that justifies the human use and the manipulation of non-human nature within what Naomi Klein calls extractive capitalism. And just a few quick things to note. First, I think it's clear that this logic is at the root of many of the biospheric crises we're facing today: climate change, biodiversity collapse, the pollution of water, the degradation of soil, and more. Second, the nature-society dualism, like all of these dualisms, is simply a lie. Not only is human well-being intimately tied to the health of non-human nature, right? So we are not separate from nature. But even more, human life is in fact entirely dependent on the endless gifts that we receive from microorganisms, from healthy forests, from pollinators, predictable weather patterns, and so much more. Third, and this is what I think Nixon's book is so insightful around, it's crucial to stress that ecological degradation is intimately tied to these other systems of white racism, heterosexism, colonial violence, and the capitalist exploitation of workers. And so finally, and I'll end with this, because of this, it's clear that the kind of deep solidarity needed today has to include human solidarity with more than human nature. If we human creatures have any hope of being sustained for much longer on this planet, we actually have no choice but to build systems that prioritize a deep socio-ecological solidarity with our non-human kin.
Yeah, those are. Oh, please go ahead, Jeremy.
Yeah, Tim, I just want to say, I find that so inspiring because we don't tend to think of solidarity as the kind of relationship with more than human nature, right? We think solidarity is something humans have with each other, and then some other kind of category is what humans have with more than human nature. But it's what you're saying is it's so powerful to say, no, it actually belongs to the same category of relationship, right? Because unless solidarity is something humans share with the rest of nature, then it's just reinforcing that division that says people are beings that deserve solidarity and non-people other than human deserve something else that's not solidarity. So I just really appreciate that.
Yeah, I mean, we're at a moment where many of us are rightly recognizing the need, to use the language from Joerg Rieger and Kwok Puilan of deep solidarity across race, gender, class, other social identities and locations. And there's, in one sense, we can say, yeah, and that should include environmental groups. What I'm stressing and what you're picking up here is not just environmental groups, but non-human nature itself, right? Mycorrhizae, animals, birds, trees, watersheds, waterways, the atmosphere, right? These are all allies. These are all life forms that sustain and support human life. And so the real question is, will we human beings be smart enough in time to respond in deep solidarity with our non-human kin? And I'll just note in saying that, right, it is our indigenous traditions which have long known this and affirmed and lived with concrete practices this kind of deep solidarity with non-human nature.
Yeah, great points. So you've both laid out, I think, pretty concretely what some of the challenges that we are all facing right now are, but I'm also interested in talking a little bit about how something like solidarity can make a difference. So I would like you both to think about and respond to how solidarity might be able to make a difference in our economy, make economic change, and maybe lead us to alternative, more just economies. Tim, would you like to take this question first, or Jeremy?
Well, yes, I'd be happy to. There's so much to engage here. I mean, on the one hand, I think we need to note that among the many divide and conquer tactics that systems of domination employ, we should name at the very foundations of capitalism in 16th century England, we saw the beginnings of the land enclosures movement, which has been followed around the world with the imposition of colonial capitalism, of the separation, the estrangement of the majority of human beings from a deep, close relationship with land and landscapes. And so among our many strategies to seek liberation, to work for more social, democratically social, collectivist, cooperative, mutually egalitarian economic systems, I think we have to include movements that are working for land sovereignty, for land redistribution, to help reconnect the majority of the Earth's people back to an intimate relation with land and landscapes.
Yeah, for sure. Let me add to that. Well, first of all, let me build right off that. One of the things that I've found most encouraging is in recent years, I've been studying more about practices of regenerative agriculture and agroecology. Tim, I know that's something you've engaged a lot too. And one of the important insights from that, to my mind, applies not just to agriculture per se, but to it provides a way to think about the entire human relationship with the rest of nature. And that is this insight that the things that human beings need to live, food in the more specific case of regenerative agriculture and agroecology, those things that humans need, we can draw them from the ecosphere in ways that, rather than harming the ecosphere, can actually help rebuild and repair the ecosphere's own capacities to sustain life. And so it doesn't have to be an either or choice, human survival or the rest of nature, that there are ways largely driven by indigenous knowledge, as you pointed out, that can allow humankind to survive, but in ways that enhance the life of the whole planet. And I think that gets us back to, I mean, the whole series is Liberating People and the Planet, to realize that liberating people and liberating the planet can be connected with one another, that they can be deeply tied. And if I could just say one other movement alongside that, that I think is a very different movement, but echoes a lot, is movements among certain labor unions that do a lot of care labor and that have put a lot of focus on articulating their demands, not just in terms of their own workers, but in terms of the whole community. And what's good for local. I'm particularly thinking of a number of more militant teachers unions, food worker unions, food chain worker unions, excuse me, a number of nurses unions, where the way they've articulated their goals is to say, look, we're part of whole communities. We serve communities and we live in communities, and it's the whole community that we're fighting for. And although they don't always articulate the demands in addition in terms of the environment, I think it's not very much a leap to then extend that knowledge even further. So I think those are two dimensions where solidarities are not bubbling up. They've been there for a long time, but they're taking shape in ways that directly attack the issues you just named, Tim.
Yeah, for sure. So we just have time for one more question under this big umbrella before we move on to the next question. And based on what you both just said, I was wondering if you could both give examples of groups that are doing the kind of solidarity work that you were talking about for people who are listening, so they can look up and see.
Jeremy lifted up several. Let me also note the Indigenous Environmental Network. Let me point to the Boggs Center, celebrating and continuing the work of Grace Lee Boggs in Detroit, which links together racial, economic justice with cooperative land trusts, urban farming, indigenous wisdom, cooperative ownership of socially and environmentally oriented enterprises, right? I would point to Cooperation Jackson, the US Food Sovereignty Alliance, at the global level, La Via Campesina, Landless Workers Movement in Brazil. I mean, there is a global movement of earth-based, agroecologically based movements that are linking together land sovereignty, racial justice, rejection of extractive capitalism, and these more cooperative, integrative, egalitarian models of political economy. I think we need to build on them. I think we need to recognize that the state can be a tool to amplify their efforts to redirect our collective resources away from supporting a fossil fuel economy, the agro-industrial economy, toward these other locally based, place-based egalitarian models.
Those are all awesome. Let me just briefly add a resource that I've been recommending to lots of people is David Montgomery's book, Growing a Revolution, where he profiles farmers and farmer groups all around the world that are doing regenerative agriculture. And part of why I like it is because for people who aren't as familiar with regenerative agriculture, conservation agriculture, agroecology, it gives some really nice on the ground, pardon the pun, but on the ground case studies of what these practices are like. And then there's a number of great works around, I think one of the pivotal things, I hope, one of the pivotal moments of solidarity I want us to all be paying attention to is the work that the Chicago Teachers Union has been doing for the past couple of years. And there's a number of books recently that explore particularly their 2012 fight. Part of the reason that's important is because their fight for their new contract in 2012 was an inspiration to teachers across the country, including many red states in the heart of Appalachia, to think about a broader vision for solidarity. And I think it's a case study that shows us all is not lost, and there is much power when workers and communities come together and say, we're not going to have an economy and a society that operate the way it has been. We're going to build something better for all of us and for all of our children and for our whole communities.
Great.
Let me thank everybody for these questions and Annika for leading us in the first round of questions. You have a final comment. Do you want to add, Annika?
No, yeah, thank you both for a really thoughtful discussion of this first question, and I'm excited to see what you have to say for the second part.
After the second part, let me remind the audience that we will be taking questions, so feel free to post your questions in the chat. They will be funneled to us, and we will get to them in about 15 plus minutes in this webinar. This second part of our webinar, I want to emphasize the question of religion. You know, we're certainly talking about economics, we're talking about politics, and I think what Annika was saying is really crucial. Too often social movements focus almost exclusively on politics and don't get to the economic question. I think we've already touched on that. Economics is crucial. It helps build stronger politics, undergirded. Those kinds of things are valuable for anything that we do. But once you add religion into the mix, you wonder, you know, I think those of us who study it on a daily basis, we know that religion has a lot of problems. It also has some promises. But wouldn't one expect religion to be a place where solidarity can form, right? I mean, some people define religion based on its etymology as that which ties people together. So, bringing people together is what religion does. The truth is that religion oftentimes divides people as well. And so what's going on here? What's happening, especially in the United States? Why is solidarity not practiced in religion, and what do we do about it? How could we use religion for more constructive purposes? Let me start with Tim first, and then move on to Jeremy.
So religion is about ultimacy, about what we most deeply value and venerate. When we use the word God, we're speaking about ultimate values, about what we believe ought to govern our lives. And in that sense, I think it should be clear that capitalism is itself a religion, right? The near infinite pursuit of profit maximization is arguably the religious vocation to which we are all bound, right? It's on the altar of the god of mammon that we are expected, simply assumed, to sacrifice the lives of workers, especially those deemed less than fully human, along with the rest of non-human nature. So this is where I would suggest that we scholars of religion, we faith leaders, those of us who steward traditions, might have particular contributions to offer in this work of transitioning beyond extractive racial capitalism. Among other things, we're particularly well trained to examine religious systems, right? That's what we do. And that ought to include the inherently religious character of the domination frameworks that control our lives, including especially capitalism. Now, for those of us who claim a particular tradition, especially a dominant one like Christianity, the work also includes naming how our unique beliefs and practices have all too often been complicit in the logics and the practices of conquest. But then it also involves embracing and lifting up, this is the more joyful work, the more liberatory, the egalitarian, this life-sustaining resources within our respective traditions. So I'm a Christian theologian. That makes me especially responsible for what Christians believe and teach about what is most valuable, most ultimate, right? And I'm afraid the truth is that many of the dominant expressions of modern Western Christianity have just assumed and sanctioned some form of anthropocentrism. That includes teachings about human nature, right? The spirit-body hierarchy, about salvation, right? We're saved apart from the earth. We leave the earth. It includes teachings about the nature of God, God's relationship to the world, right? And more. But at the same time, there are also so many non-dominant expressions of Christianity that have expressed a profoundly earth-affirming, biophilic, and regenerative set of theological beliefs and practices. And so, as an eco-theologian, one of my greatest joys is being able to point to and participate in lifting up those particular expressions in solidarity with those who are stewarding other wisdom traditions, who are similarly committed to this great transitionary work.
Thank you. I mean, there is solidarity right there, and this is already broadening the conversation beyond humanity to all of the world and all of the earth. We'll come back to that in a minute. Jeremy, what's your take on religion and solidarity here?
Yeah, so first of all, I really co-sign everything you've just been laying out, Timothy. I think it's really important, both critique and construction. I want to add to it two pieces. There's kind of good news and bad news. I'll start with the bad news and then good news. And probably neither of these is a surprise to people watching this webinar, but I want to just name them. I think a real struggle and sometimes a real barrier, and here I need to acknowledge, I'm mostly talking about the religious tradition I know best, and that's Christianity here in the US. But I think a real struggle is that Christianity tends, and Christian communities tend to be much more comfortable thinking of poverty as a fundamental justice issue rather than thinking of capitalism itself as a fundamental form of injustice. And the problem with that is, as long as the problem is poverty, then it's an external social problem, as opposed to, as Timothy pointed out, as opposed to the whole system we're in. That's the problem. And I think, again, I'm not saying we shouldn't care about poverty, but when we frame the problem primarily as poverty and don't explicitly name that poverty is a result of how capitalism operates and is inherent in how capitalism operates, then we're not fully targeting the underlying causes. And I think part of the reason this is a struggle is because it gets to a broader point about solidarity, and that is, as many watching this webinar will be well familiar, solidarity requires taking sides. And religious communities, Joerg, as you pointed out, by their nature are oriented towards wanting to gather people together and wanting to create connections. That's not a bad thing, but solidarity requires taking sides. You have to choose to take sides. The preferential option for the poor is a preferential option, right? It's not just one of many options. And so that doesn't always sit easily with religious communities. One thing I do want to say, and this is the good news part, one of the things I think religious communities can contribute is that, precisely to Tim's point, because religious communities deal in ultimate matters, they have the possibility of addressing people's full lives and their whole persons potentially. And if religious communities are committed to being truly diverse and inclusive communities, it means they're communities where people who have lots of different interests and concerns that they share. And I think that's a resource for getting beyond some of the silo effect we often see in progressive movements particularly, right? Just because there's only 24 hours in the day, we each make choices about where we can invest our energies. religious communities, when they address our whole person and when they intentionally are diverse and inclusive, provide a space where different people's fundamental concerns can connect with each other and build diverse solidarity, I guess we could say.
Thanks. I mean, I think that takes us in the right direction. Let me push it a bit further, though. If you think about agency, right? Here we're not just talking about what is happening to people, poor people, the earth, what is happening to working people, but let's also talk about how working people and the earth have some agency in helping us push in a different direction. I think that's where the hope lies ultimately, right? It's not just that, you know, we're hoping some well-meaning people eventually will come together, but that there's a new agency bubbling up from unexpected places. To me, that's also a question of theology and God, because too often we see God's agency as dominant agency from the top down. The way you see, you know, dominant cultural actors, you see dominant political actors, you know, including perhaps the current president, and certainly how you see dominant economic actors, CEOs, and so on. If we turn this around and we see working people, we're now talking about essential workers. We didn't ever talk about that in those terms, right? We now see essential contributions of the earth. How could religion help us to see this agency more clearly and maybe then bring it together in a new solidarity movement?
So, Joerg and Annika and Jeremy, as you know, the paper that I had written for the conference that was converted into this excellent webinar series, I played around with the emergent Christian animist theologies, Mark Wallace in particular. He's got a wonderful book out in 2018 called When God Was a Bird, Christianity, Animism, and the Reenchantment of the World. And part of what he does in that book is argue precisely for a theological vision that links human liberation with ecological liberation. To speak within the language of the Christian tradition, he talks about the Holy Spirit as the green face or the animal face of God, right? And so he talks about a double incarnation within the Hebrew and Christian scriptures of God incarnate, not just within the human being of Jesus, which then is the grounds upon which to talk about the divine dignity of all human life, but also the incarnation of the Holy Spirit within the elements of earth and air and water and fire, and then in particular within the bird, right? The Holy Spirit as a dove. And so what that does is from within the logic of the Christian tradition, provide us a way of re-enchanting not just human life and the sacrality of human life, but all of created life. I mean, capitalism operates on the exploitation of human workers and the earth. And it's precisely this logic of assuming that nature is there for our use, to manipulate, to profit from, that justifies. So to re-sacralize birds, pollinators, trees, water, etc., is a theological ground upon which to build a new economy, what I would argue for a democratically eco-socialist economy.
Let me just add just a little bit to that and say that one of the things that I think the current pandemic has made clear, has always been true, but the current pandemic has made very pointedly clear, is that the most important power and the most important source of power is power that happens at the point of production. And we need to think about production broadly, right? So it's not only paid production, but it's also the production upon which capitalism depends in terms of caring for our communities, right? So unpaid reproductive labor that keeps our communities going, as well as, of course, unpaid ecological or ecosystem labor that's occurring as well. But those are all three interconnected, indivisible points of production, and that's where the power lies, right? So that is when people / workers at those 3 points of production, people and all of the ecosphere, decide collectively, say, you know what, we're not going to allow our productive capacities to be used in the exploitative ways Tim just outlined, that's where power comes from. And I think we're already starting to see it, where there is organizing among essential workers in the kind of more narrow technical sense, starting to say, look, we're not going to let ourselves be put in positions of unsafety and demanding better working conditions. The Amazon workers, grocery workers, there is a kind of new militancy. So capitalism has had to admit something in naming certain workers are essential. And one of the powerful possibilities right now is to not let go of that essentialness, but also not let that essentialness be defined on capitalism's terms, right? Workers are essential to the degree that they help keep life going and help sustain the life of the planet. Not to the degree they keep profit going, but to the degree that they sustain our collective life possibilities. That's what makes workers essential, and that's where power comes from, is not letting capitalism define that essentialness, but rather defining it in terms of our care for each other and our liveliness with the entire planet.
Thank you so much. This is very inspiring, because I think this is where some of the hope lies. I would argue this is power that's already at work. We don't have to conjure it up. It's already out there. I mean, working people are already at work in production. It's just like we're not always noticing it. The bird is out there. We might not call it productive labor. It's certainly reproductive labor. And those two things should not be split apart as they oftentimes are. So once you bring that together, one could argue that that's where the solidarity happens, as working people work together with each other across the various divides, which are really divide and conquer. They want to keep us separate. This is what the racial divide, the gender divide, and so on do to us. They keep working people separate, and then they keep us separate from nature. So once we bring that together, I think there's some real hope. We need to move on in just 1 minute, but let me ask you if you could maybe just 30 seconds each, since we're talking religion here, and we're talking about it broadly, but do you think there would be images of the divine that could be more helpful? I mean, Tim already talked about the Holy Spirit and the dove. But how do we get rid of these images of the divine working from the top down and controlling us like some of our politicians and CEOs are doing these days?
Let me just briefly continue your comments from earlier, Joerg. Lift up the images of God from below, the subversive God, the spirit who is at work within these multiple uprisings amidst the overlapping crises of capitalism. We see the uprisings in the streets, we see uprisings on the factory floor, we see uprisings within so many of our working environments. And I think we too need to talk about the reality that nature too is uprising, right? The oceans are rising up. Global temperatures are on the rise. We're seeing a rise in superstorms, massive droughts, wildfires, droughts, right? You might say that nature itself is trying to throw off the domination systems of the last 400 years. And so I think it's and I recognize we need to be careful in how we talk about that, because those who are suffering the most from nature's crises are more often those who are suffering from these other systems of domination. But the capacity to see and to link up these multiple uprisings and this vision of deep socio-ecological solidarity, I think is a profoundly hopeful one.
I'll just throw in real quick, in a text that's sacred in both Christian and Jewish traditions, in the book of Genesis, there's the role of Ruach, which is often translated the breath of God. One of the things that has just struck me in recent years is that it's also a powerful metaphor for ecosystem processes that can sustain life, and the cyclical nature of the biosphere, where everything becomes the possibility for everything else to live. And that completeness is so different from capitalism, which opens the door to endless accumulation and supposed limitedlessness. But the circulation of ruach throughout creation, enlivening creation, points to both possibility within, contained within a whole, so that no part of the whole is simply exploiting and extracting from the rest of the whole.
Thank you so much. I wish we could go on more talking about these questions, but we'll have conversations later, and some of this will be eventually in the book. This is our time now to go on to the Q&A. Some questions have already been posted, and Annika will lead us into the first one.
All right, so one question that I thought we should address right away is that a listener asked us to define capitalism. And I think that's something useful to think about, because in sociology, it's usually thought of as just an economic system. But I think what we're really talking about here is how capitalism is a system that has really changed our relationships with other people as well as the planet. So I just thought we could start, if you all would maybe briefly talk about that.
Yeah, one of the things I'm developing right now is a more of an ecological definition of capitalism. That is to say, capitalism fundamentally is about a certain part of the ecosphere, that is a certain group of humans, but a certain part of the ecosphere imposing divisions and hierarchies, as Tim talked about earlier in the conversation, on other parts of the ecosphere, so as to make ecological processes, and I include human tasks of sustaining life as part of ecological processes, certain parts of the ecosphere colonize other parts of the ecosphere and force them, use force to make them, put them towards profit making. So I think, like, traditionally, it's primarily been more about capitalists and workers, and that's still true, but we need to also broaden and say, what is it that capitalists do to human workers and to the entire ecosphere to make the rest of the ecosphere serve for the production of endless profit?
So very briefly, I would say capitalism is an infinite process of the exploitation and the appropriation of surplus value through exploiting and dispossessing people and planet. I could go on, but let me give it that a very concise definition.
Yeah, those are great definitions. I think it helps kind of contextualize our conversation and use of the term.
There were several questions in the Q&A about capitalism, so we're sort of getting into this conversation. And I think the last thing anybody wants to do here is just to bash an economic system that also has, you know, in some time, you know, in history has done some work for humanity that benefits us. But I think we're at a stage here where we really have to rethink the fundamentals. And following up on Annika's question a minute ago, if you think about capitalism, then not simply as an economic system, but something that shapes relationships, that shapes us all the way to the core, and ultimately shapes our deepest desires, including our beliefs. This is why I, as a theologian, oftentimes felt that's what we have to address. How is this shaping us? And so then the question is, of course, how do we get out of it? And we've been talking about that for most of the hour. One of the questions that was put to Jeremy in the blog was about slowing down practices. You know, so the question here is, you know, how could in this speeding up process of capitalist production and the race towards bigger and bigger profits, how could slowing down actually be employed here? And is this something that we might be seeing in the current Black Lives Matter movement, in the protests? What are your thoughts on that, Jeremy?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I agree that the slowing down that's had to happen because of the coronavirus creates a space where we can all start to claim going forward, as a number of commentators point out, never to let capitalism take us back to where we were, just falling back into that logic. So I think, yes, we do need to hold on to slowing things down. I do think there's a risk that we need to be conscious of. And I want to just name an article, and I'll try to get the link out. But the late great sociologist Eric Olin Wright a couple years ago laid out this typology of different forms of anti-capitalism, and he talked about a difference between escaping capitalism versus eroding capitalism. So I think some practices of anti-capitalism look more like, let's create communities that try to simply escape from it versus more deeply engage in eroding it. And he lays out this metaphor of erosion, saying, how do we, I'm sorry, so let me say this to answer the question. The slowing down that I think is most important is the slowing down of taking time to build relationships across our various identities that sustain communities that can resist the logics of capitalism. And the slowing down, I think, is also about how do we rethink the kind of communities we're part of so that we can be part of more broadly solidarity-bound communities. Slowing down to take stock of the kind of solidarities we're already in and how to grow those solidarities even more diversely to build more power.
I'll say just a couple things here. Right, this is connected with the scriptural command of Sabbath, which in its fullest sense is not just pausing briefly to be grateful and thankful and reverent. It has a whole series of implications of land having rest, land getting a year of jubilee, the redistribution of wealth that has been unjustly accumulated among a few back to the whole. It's cycles of deep rest for all. And this is where I think we can get a little, I get nervous when, middle to upper middle class Christians, we go on our retreats and talk about Sabbath, when the realities are that those who are made poor by an exploitative, extractive system don't have the opportunity to rest. And many of us at every level of the economy feel that. So if we're not getting at these systemic roots of this incessant, unyielding pace for more profit, I'm not sure if we can actually obey the commandment to practice Sabbath.
And let me just also add this. I know we've got to move to other questions. Let me also just tie this then specifically to some policy stuff, because Tim, something you said just made me think about this. So the demand for a fully livable wage index to inflation is partly a demand for working class people not to have to work two jobs just to survive, right? A call for universal basic income, or frankly, a call for universal health coverage is also a call for people to get some of their life back with the life capacities they need to make communities happen. So some of the slowing down happens through the very capitalism operates through various forms of taking our time, and various kinds of policy demands are also about getting some of that time back. We need to get some of the time back within which we can do the slowing down, because Tim, you're absolutely right. So many people don't have the capacity for Sabbath because you can't eat and take Sabbath in capitalism.
Time is moving fast, so let me see if I can pose a quick final question that puts together some of the concerns that were raised by our listeners. And thank you so much for those great questions. We're always saving those, and we will take them along for further consideration. So even if they did not get addressed here, we will actually continue to think about them. And we only have a minute or two left, so keep that in mind. So the final thing is, I think it's been clear here where the theologians among us, we're talking about reclaiming Christian traditions, because Christianity has so much been part of the problem. But we're all agreed, I know that this is an interreligious effort. So it's not just about fixing Christianity. It's really a truer, deeper solidarity that also includes religious solidarity. So you have any final thoughts about how such solidarity could happen? And also, think about that in terms of the broader solidarity with nature, so that we're not constructing another dualism where we say, well, this is this, this is that. How does it come together for you? How do you think about that? Who wants to go first? About a minute each.
Jeremy, I'll leave the final word for you. Let me use this as an opportunity to just briefly lift up the Institute for Christian Socialism, which I, along with many others, have helped co-found this last year. Joerg, you're on the board of advisors. And the ICS is structured precisely to seek to build solidarity across Christian groups from a variety of different denominations and the broader left that's seeking to transition beyond capitalism to a more socially just, environmentally sustainable future. I think we have to link up our movements. We have to build power together. We can no longer continue to try and address these crises alone or within our respective groups. And so there's actually a webinar this Friday, Black Lives Matter and the Anti-Capitalist, Anti-Racist Church that ICS is sponsoring. I hope some of you might be able to check in with that. Joerg and Annika, let me just again say how much I appreciate this conversation. And Jeremy, it's been great.
And it's been great having you on also, Tim. And before we go to Jeremy, the webinar you just mentioned will also be advertised through the Wendland-Cook Facebook page. So this is where people can find that information. Jeremy, you do have the final word.
And it'll be a short one. I know we need to conclude. Let me say something that I've been trying to remind everyone I talk to is this: capitalism is the ism that funds all the other isms in 2020, right? The world we live in today, capitalism is how all the other isms get funded. And so part of the basis for our solidarity is recognizing all the other forces of evil that we're fighting against, they're funded through capitalism. White supremacy is not self-funding. Patriarchy is not self-funding. Ecological degradation is not self-funding. They are funded through capitalist processes. So one of the most powerful things we can do is to undercut the funding stream that sustains all these other isms. And that, for me, is why there's a pragmatic focus on capitalism separate from just the inherent moral focus on it. It's the thing that funds all the other isms.
The good news is there's something else out there, and we're pursuing it. And many of our listeners are also. It's great to know that we're in this together. So thank you, Jeremy, for this final encouragement. Unless Annika has any final words, we will turn back to Francisco.
No, yeah, I think that was a great note to end on. Thank you, Jeremy and Tim.
Thanks, everybody.
Well, friends, we thank you for joining us on this third webinar. We have been so thrilled at the robust conversation and the questions that are coming through the chat. We invite you to continue to engage with us, both online and offline, through this Liberating People on the Planet series. As you know, the Wendland-Cook Program is committed to doing this work at the intersections of so many issues and isms and from the economic, ecological, cultural, and religious problems, and to how all these things, as Jeremy mentioned, are intertwined, and how our current economic system funds so many of the injustices and structures that we see and that we are thinking and working to organize to transform. We're committed to analyzing these connections and looking at solutions, and then to organize a prophetic, lasting, sustainable response for the long haul. And we invite you to join us. We are a group that is committed to being representative and diverse in all the ways possible, and to be committed to this work for the long haul. In the academy, on the streets, in our congregations, temples, and mosques, everywhere possible. Our invitation to you is to join us and to help us understand better where we can join you in this effort. A couple of final instructions and comments. Some people were asking if this webinar will be made available later, and yes, it will be available in different places as a live stream. You can watch it on our Facebook page immediately after this is over. And for those of you who registered for the webinar through Zoom, you will also get an email with the link to watch it later. That same link will also be embedded onto all of our social media and website platforms in the coming days as well. So you'll have plenty of access to this content following today. In addition, we invite you to take a couple of other extra steps. We want you to save the date for our next webinar. We're sort of taking a turn. We've been focusing on the content that was going to be part of this conference that we mentioned, Liberating People on the Planet. We're taking a slight turn, but not much, to focus specifically on the issues of religion, faith communities, and labor, the labor movement, and how we must look at the challenges, the conflicts, and also the opportunities and the common ground in order to transform our economy the way that we've discussed today. And so we want you to save the date, Wednesday, July 22nd. The details on the panelists and the content will be forthcoming, but know that it will be a local and national conversation. We're partnering with folks from the Middle Tennessee and Nashville Central Labor Council and other partners in this conversation to really dig deep into what must be done at the grassroots level. So stay tuned for that information on registration and on the content. We want you to follow our blog series, which has featured perspectives on economics, religion, and justice. And we've been focusing on the current pandemic, but know that we are going to continue with an exciting new format and platform soon to be announced again through all of our social media platforms. Sign up for our Wendland-Cook email list, like us on Facebook, and share the good news. Finally, we encourage you to fill out the survey and give us your feedback about today's webinar, and any other follow-up questions that you have, feel free to reach out to us on our Facebook page or through our website. All of our contact information is there. Thank you again. Thank you to our panelists, Drs. Jeremy Posadas and Timothy Eberhart, for that conversation, and for Professor Rieger and for Annika Rieger for this amazing dialogue. And we'll see you next time for Liberating People on the Planet as we engage in this work. Thank you and goodbye.